If John had pulled the handle, he would have decapitated me. I remember it was a beautiful Monday morning. It was the 4th of July, 2005. I was just by myself in terms of a single Hawk. And I did have an instructor in the back of the aircraft. So I'd been given a target to pretend to bomb. Started with stopwatch. I looked to my right, and then I looked in front of me, and I saw two huge black things coming towards me, and then bang! And this huge explosion happened in the cockpit. The canopy in the Hawk has plastic explosive running down it. It's called miniature detonation cord, MDC. That cord had wrapped around my neck.
Oh my goodness.
With the bird coming in, it interfered with it. So if he had pulled it, my head would have gone, would have been the first thing, then my body would have gone after that. Following that, John pulls us up to about 3,000 feet. He takes control of the aircraft. I'm in quite a bad way. I've lost my visors, my oxygen mask has been ripped off, blood everywhere. And John said to me, Dave, I can't land the airplane. I can't see anything, there's too much blood. So you're gonna have to land it. Ooh. At that point, there's fire engines and ambulances following us down the runway. But such was the training and such was the drive and the resilience that I was flying a week later. I was back in the cockpit a week later, continuing again.
What's going through your mind and how do you stay calm through that though? What does it take to fight in one of the world's most advanced fighter jets? What does it take to lead one of the UK's most elite Royal Air Force squadrons? Our guest for today has those answers. His name is Dave Tate, and he served in the Royal Air Force for over 20 years, logging over 2,000 flying hours. You'll learn about his coming to grips with his own mortality, with how he dealt with the death of his colleagues and friends, and with the lessons the Royal Air Force really has to teach in terms of discipline, ability to receive and give constructive feedback, and how you make fast-paced decisions. Prepare to be inspired in this episode. See you on the other side. If you remember, a couple of months ago, we had Jimmy Samuels on, and he spoke about his experience in the Army. He spent about 26 years in the Army. But guess what? Today we have Dave Tate. So I watched Top Gun Maverick a couple of months ago, so I've got a ton of questions. But first of all, Dave, how are you doing?
I'm very well, and I'm glad to hear you're an instant expert because you've watched Top Gun too, so fantastic.
What movie would you say comes close enough to describing your experience in the Air Force?
Oh, not a movie as such. I think the most recent thing I've watched where I can relate to the aerial photography is Masters of the Air, which is a mini-series on Apple TV, and that looked at the American experience during the Second World War, B-17 flying forces flying into Germany, and just the horror and the speed at which things can happen in the air and go very out of control very, very quickly. I haven't seen anything as realistic as that. So Top Gun sadly doesn't come close.
Does it not?
No, but that really captured the horror, the fear, the skill, the expertise, and everything that really encapsulates someone who's doing that job.
Interesting. What aspects of your experience did you say Top Gun did not so fully capture? What parts were quite far off from the real thing?
Yeah, so I think what Top Gun doesn't convey very well is the sheer hard work that goes around every mission, every flight. And the missions, to be quite frank, if you look at Top Gun, they're not particularly realistic because there's a very sort of flamboyant blaséness in the cockpit. Actually, from experience, it's a very demanding environment. It takes complete focus and concentration, and there's a lot of control. So, for example, the very easy language between the different aircraft, or even in the cockpit in the original Top Gun, I don't really recognise that. It's far more. Generally, it's far more serious, and you're both very busy, or the formation is very busy indeed.
Right.
But what it doesn't capture is, for every hour or so you spend in the cockpit in a flight, there's probably about 6 or 7 hours of activity around that hour in terms of planning, briefing, debriefing, and then doing any sort of post write-ups. So yes, so there's a lot more effort that goes into a mission, which is the unglamorous side, which Top Gun, conveniently doesn't show.
Right. Okay. Dave, you've amassed over 2,000 hours working in the Royal Air Force. You're a mountaineer. I got to read about some of your mountaineering exploits. Commander the famous number 617 Squadron, the Dambusters.
Yes.
And you've got a lot of experience, but I was wondering if you could introduce yourself to our listeners. Who is Dave and what makes him tick?
Yeah, so Glasgow, sort of born and bred. So the city means a lot to me, and it's lovely to be back in the city again, working for JP Morgan. But the sort of the biggest part of my life up to now has been involved in the Royal Air Force in some way, shape, or form. And my early career, university, school, was really focused in joining the Air Force. And I was lucky enough to be selected to be a fast jet pilot in the Air Force, which is very demanding in its own right. And then through the extensive training that followed, I then became a fast jet pilot on the front line, so served in Iraq, Afghanistan. And then as I moved on in life, I got married. I had children, 2 daughters who are very close to me and are my world, my wife and my children. And then towards the end of my Air Force career, I was lucky enough to fly a phenomenal aircraft called the F-35, which is the most advanced tactical aircraft in the world, and also commanded the most famous squadron in the RAF, which is number 617 Squadron. So a really privileged career in the Air Force. And then for a number of reasons, which we may explore later on, I left the Air Force and I'm now enjoying a second career, and I'm very much enjoying it with JP Morgan in Glasgow with my family. So yeah, it's been a roller coaster ride, but here I am.
Ton of questions there to follow, but I was wondering if we could maybe wind back a bit and start at your upbringing. So take me to your household when you're maybe 7 or 8, right? So I'm currently in your household, in your family. What do I see?
You see two fantastic parents who were both teachers, both high school teachers, and had I think an influence in me in driving me to excel academically, although not pushy parents, very much let me find my own path and guide, which I'm really appreciative of in hindsight and retrospect. A youngster who was very sporty. I did a lot of karate when I was very young, very to a high level. I was quite a good footballer too, and as well as obviously enjoying school and a busy time at school, I was involved in a number of clubs and societies. So the Boys Brigade played a big part of my early life in Glasgow as well, and instilled a little bit of military discipline, I suppose, at an early age. Also, apart from that, I just remember very many happy days playing with friends, where in a world where the internet wasn't there or social media wasn't there, and getting out and cycling for miles away from home, playing in derelict building sites, playing in parks, and just having a fantastic time exploring and making connections. And as well too, I think another important part of my life growing up was the influence of my grandparents, and my mother's parents lived with us for a long time, and they were very close to us where we grew up in Glasgow, and they were always a constant part of my life too. So that extended family was very important as well. So generally a very happy boy, I think, working hard, enjoying life, sporty, and trying to absorb as much of his environment as possible. But yeah, very good.
Okay, and speaking about your parents, you mentioned, you described your parents as fantastic parents. What makes you say so? Why, to you, were they fantastic parents at that point in your life?
It's interesting when you say that point in your life, because I think a lot of time it's only in retrospect you look back and you think, when you're a parent in particular, and I know you're on this journey, that you're faced with decisions or you treat your children in a certain way, and you try and reflect back and say, was my experience similar? And actually, on retrospection, I thought my parents were fantastic, and at the time as well, if I'm being honest. But I think it was the fact that they instilled an easy discipline in us, my brother and I, without being too forceful. And it was a very nice family environment to grow up in, because they were supportive, but they weren't pushy at all. And I don't think they needed to be pushy or felt they needed to be pushy, because we were both quite driven in our own way. So it was like a very sensible sailor on the tiller of a ship, just every now and again giving a steer and a guide without being too invasive, if you like. So I've got very happy memories, and we didn't of being with us, doing things with us. I don't think we had a lot of money growing up, in honesty, so we didn't have many flamboyant family holidays. But we were comfortable. But I think they definitely made sacrifices, which were transparent to my brother and I because of our age, and because we were very private and we didn't want to be vocal about that, so we'd pick up signs and things. So I think they shielded things from us for the right reasons. And yeah, I think just a really loving and supportive family. And I think I'm very lucky because I know not everyone has that experience, but for myself and my brother, I think we did very well.
Interesting. Yeah. What are some of the sort of early paths that you took before then settling on the real Air Force?
Yeah. So I think probably like most children, I've had an interest in airplanes and aircraft for a long time. And since I was very young, aircraft and aviation fascinated me. And one of the bigger influences in that path was my grandfather, who was the one who lived very close to us in Glasgow, because he was in the Air Force previously. And I remember having conversations when I was about 13, 14 at the time, about to pick subjects at school. And there was a couple of teachers who I respected at school, and they said to me, Dave, what would you like to do? And I said, I'm not entirely sure. I quite like the idea of going into the Air Force. And they said, no, you don't want to do that. You want to be a lawyer, Dave. You're promising you could be a solicitor, and we need to look at you doing Latin and things like this. So that kind of stuck with me because I respected those teachers. I was in an environment where academic excellence in the school was very important and was pushed upon promising kids. So for a long time, I had my heart set in law. And even when I first started to approach the Air Force about a career or about sponsorship for university, it was as a lawyer initially.
Really?
Yeah, so that's the lengths I went to. But some things did start to change, and 2 or 3 things began to change my calculus. And the first one was when I went to the careers office in Queen Street in Glasgow to have my conversations about joining the Air Force. And I said to them, hey, this is me, 15-year-old Dave, and I want to be a lawyer in the Air Force. And he said, all right, okay, why do you want to do that? Because most people want to be pilots. It's like, because school and all the rest of it. And I said, I'm really keen to get sponsored for university, so I'd like you to support me for university. And he said, oh, we don't do that. You need to go and do your degree first of all, then go in 2 years practicing in a law firm, and then come and see us when you're 27, 28 years old. So that put me off entirely. And also at that time, I was doing a subject at school called economics. And economics really opened up my eyes. I loved it because for the first time, I was being exposed to real world events, to politics, policy, geopolitics as well. And I really was enthused by it. And I started to understand the interconnectedness of things, how interconnected not only globally we are, but also economies, and how fragile they can be, how politics interferes, and how the military by extension also has an effect as well. So that gave me a real sort of fascination, which has always stayed with me for politics, geopolitics, and policy and decisions and how things are made. So I had that going on as well. And then I had a good friend at the time, who was interested in a career in aviation, but not in the Air Force. And he was beginning to pursue that path with British Airways and getting in on their cadetship scheme. So I was listening to him. I had the disappointment of being told, if you want to come be a lawyer in the Air Force, you have to come back in 10 years and see us or more. And I was in the subject of economics. And I thought to myself, do you know what? I really do love airplanes. And there's absolutely no reason at all, as far as I can see, why I couldn't be a pilot. So when I was 15 or 16, I really started to question this and say, I can't see a reason why, apart from the fact a few teachers a few years back looked down on it as a second profession. So,
do you know why that was, by the way?
I think it was just naivety and ignorance. I think it's the fact perhaps they didn't see flying as being as prestigious or that type of thing. When I was leaving the Air Force, a lot of people asked me, or a lot of people presumed you were joining an airline, won't you? And I said, no, absolutely not. It's going from driving a Formula One car to driving a bus. It's completely different. It's completely different. So I think there is a bit of ignorance about the career itself and the complexity of the career. And some of the brightest people I have met, I've had the privilege of meeting, flew with me in the Air Force. Seriously bright people. So I think it was just that lack of understanding.
Right, okay.
Really. But yeah, it was this inner journey where I was building confidence in my own decisions. And I was beginning to stand up and say, I'm taking in all this advice and all this information from around me and all these perceptions of me and all these kind of desires that people have for me. And I'm beginning to see actually adults and these influential people are not infallible and they can make mistakes as well. And actually, it's me, and I'm beginning to trust my own judgment and have my own confidence, stand on my own 2 feet and say, no, I don't want to do that. I want to do this. And these are the reasons why I want to do this as well. And as I developed that confidence and grew, I became more certain that's what I wanted to do in the end. Yeah.
When you told your parents that you were pursuing with the real effort, what was the reaction like? And I'm just quite keen to dig a little bit into how you build your confidence into your own decisions without letting external forces and voices shape your story.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think it happened, it wasn't I don't think a big kind of discussion we had over a dinner table one night or whatever. It happened over time. And I think one of the things which helped pave the path for that, there was two things actually. One was the Air Force's schemes to sponsor you for university were very good at the time, both financially and also in terms of the training they gave you during that time. And the other thing as well, which helped cement my interest more, was I joined the Air Cadets when I was about that 15, 16-year-old age. And that was brilliant because that gave me an exposure to the organization at a level. I met some really interesting people who weren't in my immediate sort of friendship group from school, but doing quite a diverse background. Because the Air Cadet I was in wasn't in a relatively well-off area, it was quite a poor area. So I met a lot of different kids, which was fantastic, which I wouldn't normally come into contact with. And I think from just seeing a lot of these children sort of grow in confidence because of the training that they were giving us.
Oh, I see.
It was fantastic. So my parents, I think, saw that as well. They saw I had this additional interest outside of school, which was developing me and developing my confidence a lot quicker than school was. So there was that part of it. And I think the thing as well, which helped cement my parents into this was a really positive thing I was doing, was was a preparation to be selected, because I first went down to be selected, which was a very rigorous process. It still is actually. But I was 16 going on 17 when I went down to a place called Royal Air Force Cranwell and the Officers and Aircrew Selection Centre for 4 days. And you are with 100 other very bright individuals, and they put you through 4 days of testing, in essence, to see if you are the person that's worth the job at the end and worth the money, in essence. So it was all the preparation for that and the hard work I was putting into that, and my parents were saying, what are the tests? What are they doing to you? How are they assessing you? And they realized this is a big deal, in essence, and this is a hugely competitive thing. And I think the statistic, which I heard often when I was in the Air Force, that about 1 in every 1,500 got selected.
No way.
Yeah, so it's a very small pool you have, very competitive environment. So to be selected, let alone complete the training, is phenomenal in its own right. But yeah, the whole journey of what the Air Force were willing to provide me to help me through my university education, the journey, the training, the people I was surrounding, how I was developing as an individual, I think my parents really valued that.
Okay, so you're a 16-year-old, you're on the train going to Cranwell. What's going on in your mind at that point?
So I remember just reading lots and lots of newspaper articles, because one of the infamous parts of the interview was asking you to talk about 5 stories which caught your eye in the press. Okay, and of course, where people failed was on the train. Usually it's a Sunday you went down to Cranwell, so you could tell the people who'd picked up a Sunday Times in the morning and were just looked at today's news effectively and recited that.
Yeah.
And actually, what we wanted was a bit of a history of something. So you something that caught your eye, perhaps in the past 2 months. And so if it was something, if it was Gaza, it was Israel. Right, tell us about the history of that. So the recent history, what built up to what you're seeing in the paper now. So you had to show an understanding, which they could probe and quiz into as well. So yeah, so there was a lot of swatting up in terms of newspaper stories and so on.
And why is that skill particularly important, or that this subset of skills of understanding history and geopolitics? Why do you think that's important to the field of piloting in the Air Force?
It's very important. So all pilots in the Air Force are officers, okay? And Cranwell is the officer training school, if you like, officer training college. Okay. So officers have a very demanding role, because and this is where imposter syndrome can come in, from a very young age, some as young as 18, after their initial training, they're given a lot of responsibility where they might be asked to lead and command a group of 30 people. And sometimes these people will have been in the service 20 years plus. So suddenly, as a youngster who doesn't have any life experience really, certainly not marriage, children, suddenly you are responsible for individuals who are perhaps been through 2 or 3 divorces, have got several kids.
Oh my goodness.
Maybe even grandkids. And you've got to be credible. But one of the things where you can add that credibility is when you are asked to do something. So let's just say, hypothetically, to go overseas, to deploy, to protect something. then you can sit down with your team and you can say, we have been asked to do this. This is why we've been asked to do this. And you can provide that context, that history. You can talk about the politics.
I see.
And importantly, you can talk about the factions as well and the history behind it and sectarianism and so on. So actually having a skill for picking up the wider context and having a general education about things is very important for giving context.
Okay. And still just talking about your upbringing, because I find your journey very fascinating. And one aspect I find really intriguing is the confidence you had in your own choices at that sort of age, but also almost like self-awareness and ambition around what sort of things you wanted. You mentioned that both yourself and your brother were ambitious. Where do you think that came from?
I think it's a good question, actually. I think probably my dad's side, to be honest with you. So my dad's a lovely man. He's a very bright individual. And I think I wouldn't say he is a massively driven individual, but he's very good at what he does. He's a very successful teacher and obviously a wonderful father. But his family, when you look at my uncles, his brothers, his father, they all were very driven individuals, very ambitious, and they did very well. But I think one of the nice things about my family, one of the things I'm very lucky about is that we're all very close. So despite this drive and this ambition, it's a nice ambition, but we're still very family orientated, very supportive. So I think probably inherently it came from that, a desire to succeed and desire to do well.
Gotcha. And just speaking about like the treatment that the Air Force gave you, when I was researching for this episode, I came across this joke. Tell me if it's accurate, okay? So here's the joke. Servicemen from the Royal Navy, the Royal Marines, the British Army, and the RAF, we are each asked the same question. On detachments to Saudi Arabia, you find a scorpion in your tent. What do you do? The Royal Navy says, I kill it with my shoe. The Royal Marines says, I eat it. The British Army says, I make a pet of it. And the Royal Air Force says, I phone reception and ask what the tent is doing in my hotel room. Is that fairly accurate?
It's entirely accurate, yeah.
Is it?
So there's a very healthy banter between the services. An Air Force reply would be, any fool can be cold and wet. If you decide to live in a trench for a living, that's your issue. But quite frankly, I'd rather stay in a tent or a hotel, quite frankly. So there's always this kind of banter, this camaraderie, which happens. But yeah, the Air Force generally has a reputation for being a little bit more comfortable than the other services. Right. And I think that's largely because it's not always the case. It's a generalization. But in my particular world, where the aircraft I flew, you had to generally have very well standing airfields and structures. So you wouldn't ever fly from a dirt strip somewhere in the aircraft I flew. So generally, you were in very well protected air bases. So therefore, you had accommodation, which wasn't palatial, but it was much better than some of my army colleagues and brethren. And my wife's in the army, so I have this conversation all the time with her. Yeah, and about what they had out in the field, for example. So yeah, so there's a little bit of humour there, but yes, there is a little bit of truth in there just to make it interesting.
Okay. And something else that I read about is that the Royal Air Force places a lot of intentionality on more intellectually more rigorous training than it is physical. Let's talk a bit about the physical training as well. Yeah. So as you progressed through, again, the only experience I have of the Air Force is through Top Gun. So I want you to keep me in check.
Sure.
What's it like to actually train to be a pilot physically?
It's a great question. It's probably different from what a lot of people think. So one of the things, I'll give an example. I'm quite a small guy. I always have been quite a small guy. And I used to think that was a disadvantage in many ways in the past. And when I got into the flying world, I realized two things about height. One is cockpits are small. So someone like you, Sam, you would really struggle in some of our cockpits. You'd be really cramped and trying to maneuver around would be very difficult. So the smaller you are, the comfier it is. The second thing is G-force. Okay.
What's that?
So G-force effectively is the force that your body experiences at high speed when you go into a turn, in essence. So it's centrifugal force, in essence. So if you can imagine you are in a roller coaster, or you are driving a car very fast around a bend, you will feel a certain force, in your body. So Formula One drivers feel it. It's a slightly different force that we feel. So if you're driving a car very quickly around a bend, you will feel a force lateral force, left or right. In aircraft, you tend to feel a force up and down through your spine, if you like. And the quicker you go and the more agile your aircraft is, the more G it pulls. So I'll give you an example of what G is, what it actually means. So at the moment, we are experiencing 1G, 1 times the force of gravity. So gravity is keeping us on the ground. If you experience 2G, that's twice the force of gravity. So your body feels twice as heavy. Some of it, aircraft, I was fine. 7G, 8G, 9G aircraft. Ooh. So if you can imagine, you are, and some of our aircraft are so high performing that they can sustain that level of force. So if you are sustaining 7G, 8G for, let's say, a minute, so your body is feeling 8 times heavier than it normally does, which means that moving your arm is a physical effort. You've got to be careful moving your neck, because if you move your neck in a very easy way without thinking, you'll snap your neck or you'll tear tendons and things. Ooh. And of course, helmets are quite heavy, we wear as well. So it's not only physically exhausting, but actually just doing simple things in the cockpit with that kind of force. And actually you're having to maneuver your head around to look and see who you're fighting as well. So the reason why that's important is a lot of the physical effort that we put into our training is about increasing strength in certain parts of the body. So things like back, neck, leg. And what we do not want to do, unlike Top Gun, which kind of it perpetuates this kind of myth that everyone's a real bodybuilder and likes muscle mass. Muscle mass is not good for this kind of thing, because muscle mass increases blood flow to muscles. Okay, what you do not want to do is have blood pull away from your central organs in your brain to other parts and other extremities in your body. So lean muscle is very important. So lots of reps, light weights, very important. Too much aerobic fitness is not good as well. So it's a fine balance between being cardiovascularly fit to sustain G, but if your heart rate is too low, that's not great. And the reason being that the column of blood between your heart and your brain is very important. So that kind of 50 centimeters, if you like. And if you can imagine, if you have a very slow heart rate, then the blood isn't being pumped up that much. And that column of blood it's still got mass, it's still got weight attached to it. So if you're pulling 9G, that column of blood and that pump down here is going to have to fight against that weight. And this is what G-lock is. So that's why people sometimes go unconscious. It's when the blood from this sort of position here up to the brain isn't sustained by your heart, and you lose blood in the brain and your eyesight goes and everything goes and you lose consciousness until that force relaxes and then everything starts functioning again. So a lot of technique and a lot of the exercises that pilots do, particularly high performance pilots, is they practice straining maneuvers which tense the muscles to keep the blood in the upper half of your body to stop you from blacking out, in essence. And we wear equipment as well which aids that too.
I see.
So we wear something called G-pants, we can talk about a bit later on if you want, and jackets, pressure jackets, which help us squeeze against them, they inflate, a bit like getting your blood pressure taken at a doctor's. Right. And that helps us keep the blood and stop us from blacking out as well. So it's a really complicated answer actually, because it's not an easy thing to train for. You've got to be very specific about training. And you'll never find, certainly successful pilots, you'll find probably successful pilots, good fighter pilots are girls who are relatively thin, cardiovascularly fit, but not necessarily marathon runners. Wow. And they're quite strong. Lean muscle, but not huge muscle mass to attract blood away from the center of the body.
Okay, is this why? Because I was watching like a YouTube video around the F-35Bs, and I think one of the things that I saw is the helmet has like a visor, and you could see through parts of the plane without having to necessarily turn a lot. Is that particularly why that's useful for fighter pilots? Because you don't have the luxury of just quickly snapping.
It's partly that, yeah. I mean, it's a phenomenal capability, the F-35 helmet, and that helmet is tailor-made for you, so it's laser molded to you. Okay, it's a very expensive helmet. I think the last figure I heard was about £300,000
for the helmet alone. Helmet. How much is the plane?
The plane is about £110 million. Okay, so it's a very expensive piece of equipment. But the reason why the helmet is so expensive is because you have all the kind of primary flight information is projected into the helmet. So the helmet itself is a flight instrument, okay? But the powerful thing about the F-35 helmet is that it is linked to, well, there's several things that are quite powerful about it, but one of the impressive things about it is it's linked to a series of cameras which are outside the aircraft. So what I found really impressive at night, in particular at night, was you can project the camera images onto your visor. So it's almost as if you can look through the cockpit floor and you can see like the ship below you or a road below you. So it's like you're in a bubble almost. So that's quite impressive. But the reason why, but to go back to your initial question, the reason why it's still important to move your helmet head around is that in the F-35, I could look around and see an enemy aircraft, and I could look up here and I could target it by looking at it here. So I could draw my eye to it, I could target it, and then I could fire a weapon off at it up here. Now that's important because if you went back 20 years ago or so, the only way that you could effectively lock on a missile and fire a missile was if you physically pointed the nose of your aircraft at the aircraft in front and shoot within a very small field of view.
Yeah.
Now, I can look around here, I can lock him up, and I can take a shot from here, and the missile can go and do the physics to get there. So that makes me far more deadlier. So if someone, traditionally, if you were behind me fighting me in an aircraft, you were in a position of advantage.
Yeah.
And I would be defensive if I was the guy in the front. No, actually, it's now the case where if I can get my weapon to you, if I can get a targeting solution and shoot you from anywhere, then I'm in the position of advantage. So that's the powerful thing about helmet-mounted displays. It gives you the opportunity to lock and shoot something. But of course, what that means, though, is I still need to move my head.
Yeah.
So therefore, the neck strength and all these things are really important.
Interesting. What are some attributes or skill sets a successful pilot has in the RAF?
Yeah, so really good question. So I've had the privilege of working with many good people, and I think one of the really delightful things about being in that very small professional cadre is that the selection process is rigorous. We haven't really talked about training, but the training is even more rigorous. So by the time you get to your operational aircraft and you're actually doing the job you were employed to do effectively, these people are very good. And it's not just in terms of their ability to fly airplanes, it's the whole skill set. It's the soft skills, it's their leadership skills, their communication skills, their teamwork, their ability to problem solve, and their ambition and drive to get things done. That's all important. That's all transferable, no matter what career you go into. So I think the people who are really successful tend to be the ones who understand their aircraft and their own capabilities better than anyone else. So they understand the strengths and weaknesses, how to mitigate them as far as they can. They know their system inside out, effectively. So that's the first thing. So they've got a deep professional knowledge on their own aircraft type and its roles. The second thing is the ability to then go out from a slightly more tactical picture to a larger picture where we say, I understand my bit in an air campaign or an air battle. Now I'm going to be asked to coordinate a whole air battle. So for example, I went through a training course and a pathway about 15, 20 years ago, which was preparing me to be a fighter leader, if you like, a weapons instructor. And part of that training was to teach me how to put an air battle together. So in terms of all the other different aircraft, all the other skills, all the other skill sets and attributes that they brought to achieve a tactical problem, trying to solve it, and also coordinate it and control it in the air as well, while dynamic things are happening. So it's the ability to effectively lead and control a wide variety of different assets, which you may not be inherently familiar with, but you have enough working knowledge to put parts together to achieve something. So that's what tactical brilliance looks like. And you tend to find that the fighter leaders and usually the squadron commanders in certainly fast jet forces tend to be that type of individual as well. And they've also got very good instructional ability to convey that information and pass it on and teach people is really important also. But in addition to that, usually because of the fact of the people we recruit and we have in these types of forces, they're very good people, managers as well, and leaders. So you tend to find that as you move on, and certainly my career was like this, as you move on in the Air Force and you get promoted and you get recognized for what you're doing, you do more time at the cockpit as well in various staff jobs too. So you'll do perhaps program management jobs, or you'll be an HR manager or something of that nature. And those people are generally very good at those roles too, because guess what? A lot of the skill sets that are required to be a very successful fighter pilot are transferable as well.
Yeah. Okay. And you mentioned the training was rigorous. Talk to me a bit about like the training itself.
So it's a very long process, and it's incremental but very steep learning curve. So So my initial training was done at university, and whilst I was studying for my degree, I would, wherever I could, I would go and I'd follow through a flying syllabus called Elementary Flying Training in the Air Force, which was effectively a light aircraft, not too dissimilar from any flying club. If you wanted to go for a pleasure flight or do some lessons for a private pilot's license, quite similar aircraft. But what would make it different from our experience, different from that, is the level of supervision was much higher. We would be taught aerobatics. We would be taught formation flying as well, so flying in very close proximity to 2 or 3 aircraft. Low-level flying, navigation. So the skills that we're instilling is at that early stage were all absolutely applicable to later on in life as well. So the syllabus was much broader than a normal civilian would get in a flying club. And then at that point, after you've done that course of training, the Air Force will then look at you. So they'll look at Sam, the individual, and say, Sam, you did incredibly well here, better than your peers, so you're going to go and fly jets now. Or if you didn't do quite as well, you're going to fly helicopters. Or for those who perhaps didn't do quite as well as those two, they'd go and fly multi-engine aircraft. Now that sounds a bit disingenuous, but they're still very good pilots. They're still very good pilots, but just in terms of average, they didn't quite perform as well as them. So there's a tiering point, a streaming point then. And then after that, for me personally, from sort of 2003 through to 2005, 2006, I then went on to fast jet training. And the first part of that was on an aircraft not too dissimilar from the Spitfire in terms of performance. It was called the Tucano. I spent a year in a place called Linton-on-Ouse in Yorkshire. During that year, I did about 140 hours of flying. I flew in the simulator as well, flew 3 times a day, every day.
3 times a day?
So it was tough. And the course analogy I can use to anyone trying to relate what that feels like in terms of anxiety and pressure. Imagine doing your driving test 3 times a day, every day. Ooh. That's what it's like, except with the added bonus that if you fail, you lose your career. So it's a bit different. So that's a bit different. So, and you're assessed continually. Every sortie is assessed to the nth degree, and it's no holds barred, and it's very honest and very critical of you. So we did lose people all the time. People didn't quite make the grade. They sadly were sent off somewhere else. But then following that, I went to an aircraft called the Hawk, which is the same aircraft the Red Arrows fly, the RAF aerobatic training team. Yeah. And I spent 2 years flying that in a place called Anglesey, which is in Wales. And that is the first time where you're really taught how to fly an aircraft in anger in terms of fighting an aircraft. So we are taught how to drop weapons, to strafe, to use a gun, to dogfight, to fly tactically, to do low-level bombing. Whoa. It's also the point where I came closer to death in any time in my career was
what
during
happened?
that. So I was coming to the end of what we called the tactical weapons phase. So this was in July 2005, and basically by that time I'd done about 18 months flying the Hawk. I was coming to the end of my training, and I was looking forward to finding out where I was going to go on my frontline type of aircraft. So which aircraft I was going to fly in operations. And I remember it was a beautiful Monday morning. It was the 4th of July, 2005. And I was flying, and I did have an instructor in the back of the aircraft, a wonderful guy called Doc Letton. So the Hawk is a training aircraft, and the backseat instructor can do a little bit of flying, but really it's designed for the front seat to do all the flying. And at that stage, the backseat did very little. They were there just to supervise and assess effectively. And that morning, it was a Monday morning, and we took off, I think, about 8:45 in the morning from Wales, and the weather was not great in Wales. So I'd been given a target to pretend to bomb, and I was flying at 250 feet, so quite low, ooh, and about 450 miles an hour, so quite quickly. So I was about to commence my bombing run. So usually that stage, we didn't have any fancy computers in the aircraft, so all I had to navigate was a map, like a walking map, an ordnance survey map, a stopwatch, and a compass. So I found a lake, which I think was my initial point to guide me onto a heading to then find my target. Great, and I restarted my stopwatch because I knew if I flew this heading at that speed, 2 minutes later, my target should be there, this very small barn, I think. Found the lake, started the stopwatch, I looked to my right, and then I looked in front of me and I saw 2 huge black things coming towards me, and then bang, and this huge explosion happened in the cockpit. And first thing I remember was lots of noise, because I'm now flying a cabriolet at 450 miles an hour, and lots of wet, just lots of fluid around me, and I instinctively started to pull the aircraft up. And the first thing I did was I stuck my hand up into the airstream and put my thumb up. And I'm so glad I did, because John in the back seat, and all John could see was red and blood, which was a mixture of my blood. And the two things that hit me turned out to be two ravens, so 5 kilogram ravens. So if you can imagine a 5 kilogram weight hitting you at 450 miles an hour, it's going to cause a lot of damage. So John couldn't see anything but blood. He pulled up, and when he saw my thumb go up, he thought, okay, Dave's alive, at least, in the front cockpit. And John looks down, and he looks at the engine gauge, and he sees it reading 0. And he says, oh, we've lost the engine, and we're at low level. We're going to lose energy very quickly. So usually when that happens, you may have an attempt at relighting the engine, and if not, you're going to have to eject. So get out of the aircraft using the ejection seat. So John, as he saw my thumb, the way he describes it to me is he had his hand on the handle, and basically we had a command ejection system in the Hawk. So if the back seater pulled a handle, the front seat would go as well. Okay. So the supervisory pilot would have control to take both out. And when John saw my thumb, he paused for a second and he said, hang on, there's a lot of noise, and there was a lot of wind noise, but it feels like there's engine noise as well. And we're not losing height very quickly. And he realized we had the engine, which was amazing, because if John had pulled the handle, he would have decapitated me, because the canopy in the Hawk has plastic explosive running down it. It's called miniature detonation cord, MDC. And what happens in the ejection is when you pull the ejection handle, the first thing it fires is a plastic explosive to get rid of the canopy so the seat can go up through. That cord had wrapped around my neck.
Oh my goodness.
With the bird coming in, it interfered with it. So if he had pulled it, my head would have gone, would have been the first thing, then my body would have gone after that. So my thumb, thankfully, made John pause and stop and reflect, and thankfully that didn't happen. So following that, John pulls us up to about 3,000 feet. He takes control of the aircraft. I'm in quite a bad way. I've lost my visors, my oxygen mask has been ripped off, blood everywhere. And the reason why John's engine gauge read 0 is because the bird had come through with such, or two birds had come through with such force that the back of his cockpit, where his instruments are, the bird had come through and penetrated the back of it, behind the instrument, and had knocked the instrument by about half an inch forward and disconnected the electrical connection. So it read 0 because there was no electricity going to it. So we pulled up to 3,000 feet. We managed to, we could shout at each other below 200 miles an hour. We could hear each other just. And John said to me, Dave, I put out a mayday. We're going to land at a base called Yeovilton, which is a Royal Navy base in Somerset. But I can't land the airplane. I can't see anything. There's too much blood. So you're going to have to land it. Ooh. So I spoke to air traffic control as best I could. My mask was half off. It wasn't particularly good. I think John did quite a lot of the talking for us, and I did a straight-in approach and I landed the airplane at Yeovilton. At that point, there's fire engines and ambulances following us down the runway. I pulled the aircraft over, shut down, and obviously there'd been a lot of adrenaline flowing in my body. I think from the actual instant of the birds hitting us to landing was about 12 minutes in total. And as soon as I brought the aircraft to a halt and shut the engine down, the adrenaline disappeared and I felt a lot of pain. My face was in a bit of a mess, my chest was in a bit of a mess. And when the fire teams came up to see me in the cockpit, they said, oh, because they saw the plastic detonation, the miniature detonation cord, the plastic explosive around my neck. So that took a while to cut that out and get that safe. And then I was pulled out and I was taken to hospital after that. And I still, to this day, have the scars on my chest where the raven, one of the ravens had come through with such force that it penetrated my chest. So I had to pull bones of a raven out my chest as well. But yeah, so that was an interesting day. But such was the training and such was the drive and the resilience that I was flying a week later. I was back in the cockpit a week later, continuing again. So, and that didn't feel unusual at the time. It was just part of this is the game we're in, it's dangerous, but hey, it's a dangerous profession. Yeah. And the training's been so extensive and you've been conditioned so much to be resilient. Yeah. And yeah, I went back in and I started flying a week later.
A week later? Yeah. So you've just had this accident with the ravens coming. How do you stay calm through that though?
I think the training has a lot to do with it in terms of, I mean, that's extreme. So we do a lot of emergency training, even from a very early stage in our flying careers. There's a lot of emergency training, but also in challenging situations as well. And that breeds a level of calmness and procedure. So if you encounter a problem, then there's a very methodical way to deal with it. So I think that definitely helps. The very fact that I had John in the back seat as well, and a very experienced, wise individual helped too. And I think actually John being there for that initial few minutes whilst I was coming, getting over the shock of what happened, definitely helped. And actually the straight-in approach and landing, getting the aircraft down, was relatively straightforward, because usually flying jets, we've got very elaborate ways of recovering and landing at airfields. Normally, a lot of them are tactical. So this was a very benign, like flying a 737 from holiday. It was very easy for me just to land the aircraft straight in. So I suppose a lot of instinct kicked in. The fact you have confidence that someone else is there to help and guide too, even though it was a very extreme situation. And it's something which you have, that kind of style of instinct, you've rehearsed it again and again. So it all breeds a level of calmness and control.
Okay, so of course, getting hit by ravens and having an accident is one thing, and you're having to recover from that. But one of the things, and you mentioned something about John being there as well. I think Jimmy mentioned this as well in his episode about going through the army with several people creates a strong bond, because you've been through so much together that it's not just friendship anymore. It's almost like brothers and stuff. Is that something that you relate to as well from Air Force training?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it definitely is. I think the army have a slightly different structure in terms of they have a regimental system. So, and the benefit, and now I don't think Jimmy wasn't part of a particular regiment. He was part of a corps, which is subtly different. But the point I'm trying to make is, in some cases in the British Army, some regiments, some units, there are grandfathers have served in it, fathers have, and it's passed down through generations. So there's a very close connection to family and the regiment, and therefore the brothers and sisters you have around you are almost like that. You've known them or you've known their dads or whatever else, and it is very close and very tight. Yeah. It's similar in the Air Force. It's maybe not quite the same, almost family-like bond, but what you do have with you. One of the things I in hindsight I think is wonderful, because we go through a very rigorous selection process and very rigorous training system, which is, we are not forgiven for mistakes normally, and it's very critical and very harsh. And certainly I think some of the things that I experienced when I was growing up and going through training would not be acceptable today in how you were treated and how you were spoken to. Yes. So it does bring you together. And what it does allow you to do though is I could be flying a mission in Iraq or Afghanistan with three other aircraft, and you would all get into a room at the end of it with a drink in hand, cup of coffee, cup of tea, and you sit down and you talk about it. And you could be very, not brutal, but you could say, that was unacceptable. Professionally, that was unacceptable. But the thing is, that was fine, because now some people would take offense to that. But because you were brought up in that environment, and because actually, as soon as the debrief was over, it'd be Dave and it'd be John again or whoever, and it was all friendly, because you have that. So, and tomorrow he may be giving me the telling off.
I see.
So it was this kind of, professionalism where you were absolutely brutal, because the margins for safety and the margins for error were so small, and the amount of money that you were responsible for was so vast. You really had to be quite critical.
Gotcha.
So it did breed this kind of interesting environment where it can be quite bruising at times. Yeah. But you knew it wasn't personal. It was professional. Gotcha. And then as soon as it was over, it was like, let's go to the pub, or let's go and have dinner together, or whatever else.
Gotcha. Yeah. And so speaking about like the emotional toil of being in the Royal Air Force as well, did you ever lose anyone to training or war or fight?
I did, sadly, yeah, quite a few. And sadly, I think in this business, it's just the nature of the game if you're in long enough. I think the one that affected me most was in 2012, July 2012, and it was just before the London Olympics. And at that time, I was quite a senior instructor. I was flying an aircraft called the Tornado, which I spent a lot of time flying. And at that point in my instructional career, I was teaching pilots how to fly the aircraft, but also how to fight the aircraft. And in the Tornado, we have a crew of two. And in the back seat, a bit like Top Gun, the first Top Gun, we have a weapons systems officer. So I would train the weapons systems officers as well, how to use all the systems in the back cockpit and things. But at that point, I was senior enough where I had responsibility for a whole course of students coming through, of junior pilots and junior weapons systems officers. And on a Saturday night, beginning of July 2012, it was the done thing that the course leaders would have their course over with their partners, for drinks, dinner, that type of thing. And we had a wonderful time. We lived in a military house up in Elgin, near Lossiemouth, where I was based at the time. And we met everybody, we had a few drinks, really good-natured, and my wife got to meet my team, if you like, and that was great. And then Monday morning came at work, and a few of the guys had come and given flowers for me for Kelly, my wife, and some cards to say thank you very much, wonderful evening. I went off flying that morning. I remember the weather not being particularly great around Lossiemouth. I was assessing someone on an instrument flying. I was in the back seat of the jet, and they were in the front seat flying the jet. And I landed at about 10:30 in the morning, and I went back in, and I was giving a weather report to the person who was looked after us in terms of our flying operations. And I said, is anyone going up at the moment? He said, yeah, we've got formation about to go in the next half an hour. I said, weather's not looking great. What are we doing? Oh, we're staying locally. There's a bombing range, a training bombing range called Tait, which is up not too far from Inverness, and we're going off there. I said, okay, I'm not convinced it'll be fit enough to go, but tell them to be aware of that, and the weather might not be as good as they think. So I went into the debrief of the sortie I'd just flown with the student, and we were coming to the end of that when a tannoy announcement came over the squadron, and it was something like, attention 15 squadron, can all pilots please report to the operations desk and bring your phones. And I knew from experience that meant that something had happened, because we're about to go into lockdown. We're about to stop all communications from the squadron and get everyone together. And what subsequently transpired was that we had a mid-air collision happen. So there was 2 formations of aircraft flying from 15 Squadron, my squadron at the time, and they were doing different things, but we were both finishing off in Tait range, coming from different directions. The weather wasn't great. There was an American formation in Tait range, and their allocated time, you tend to have time slots when you can go into the range, because it's quite popular. And one formation was waiting outside the range. Another formation was joining from another direction, trying to understand where the other formation was, and 2 of the jets went into each other. And sadly, so there was 4 people involved in the accident, because it's 2 people in each aircraft. Only 1 person survived, and I still think it's a miracle to this day how he survived. He was picked up out of the water 45 minutes after the accident. He was the lucky one found by the search and rescue crew, who came from Lossiemouth as well, who knew everybody involved in the accident. He was barely alive, and I think we were all surprised he survived the night in Aberdeen. Sadly, the other 3 individuals that passed away, 2 of which were my course members and who were at my house the Saturday night, who'd given the flowers and the cards to my wife and I that morning, had died. Didn't find their bodies for some time, sadly. And then the other person that passed away was one of my fellow staff members, one of my fellow instructors as well. So that hit hard, because they were young, they were mine, they had that close connection with the family, and I remember having to deal with the aftermath on the squadron of the deaths, because again, young people, they had a bigger course mates and a course as well, so they were obviously deeply affected by it. And then the funerals came. The funerals were quite hard work. For the second funeral, I led a fly past for the second funeral, which was very humbling. But I think the challenging thing about that experience in terms of the funerals was the first funeral, the parents of the individual were very pro-military and were very thankful for the help and support the military gave them, and they wanted a military funeral. The second family were not that way inclined, so you tend to find that it's either a sort of fight or flight, where you don't have to have anything to do with the military. So it was quite an awkward experience, trying to support that family and doing the fly past, and whether or not it was fully appreciated or not, I'm still not entirely sure. Although I know that a lot of my peers and the other students appreciated the fly past. So that was tough, because they were so close and so young, I think, and it was such a tragic accident that sadly took them away from us.
How do you deal with that at that point?
With difficulty. It's never easy, and I think one of the ways that we dealt with it is, and it may sound a bit strange to anyone who's not in that kind of circle, if you like, was the accident happened, I think it was a Monday it happened. And on the Tuesday and the Wednesday, there was a lot of, we need to be regimented about this in terms of belongings, supporting the family, funeral preparations, and there was always something to busy us up. And I remember emptying the lockers wasn't a particularly pleasant thing to do. But on the Thursday night, we made a decision that the whole squadron, the pilots and the operations staff, were going to go to the squadron bar and we were going to get drunk, really drunk. And an Air Force tradition was, this stemmed from the Second World War, in that if a pilot would lost a pilot in operations, you took their what's called a bar book. So in the officers' mess, which was like our social club, if you like, you didn't normally have cash transactions. You effectively had a book and you put your drinks order in that, and then someone behind the bar would tally it up, and then you'd pay a monthly direct debit end of the month. So what you did was you opened up their bar book, and we did that. We opened up their bar books, and the Air Force effectively paid for the bar tab, which was extensive, that we ran up that night. And we burned a piano. So another Air Force tradition is that you find a piano and you play a burning, flaming piano, effectively. And we had some very good pianists, and this thing burns away and stuff, and you're around it. It sounds really trivial and stupid, but it felt good, cathartic at the time. But actually, that blowout and that honesty, and there was tears that night, and there was aggression vented, and things in support. And for us, it was very cathartic. Just getting it done that night. And we didn't fly the following day, unsurprisingly. We just said, right off the next day, we'll just get this done tonight. We'll all be together, brothers and sisters, celebrate their memories, get it all out of our systems, talk about them, celebrate them, and then we can move on. And that helped. That helped a lot.
Did you fear death? How do you cope with having this close, almost near-death experiences and having losing loved ones, and what sort of kept you going for 22 years in the Air Force?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and there is no real easy way to answer it except that your own. So, depending on, I suppose, first thing is your own sense of mortality. And so what I have learned is that when I was younger, I thought about it a lot less, and I was willing to take more risk. And I think what changed the calculus was having a family, and then suddenly having people who you were solely responsible for, and they relied upon you. And I think that made you question and judge some of the things that you were doing. So I think age and just life experience makes you think and pause more about the decisions that you're taking. So I think you're right. I think as time went on, I was more aware of what I was doing, and slightly, not, I wouldn't say more apprehensive, but just, it probably helped me be a better pilot, actually, and a better supervisor, because you develop this sixth sense for what is right and what, I need to just probe at this here. So what are you telling me you want to do? You want to do what? No, that's not going to work. And being that sort of wise head. So I think that helped. Unless you're in that environment, it's really difficult to convey. But in essence, you are. Flying jets is inherently dangerous business anyway. It is, and there is risk whenever you take off or land, and even on the ground with jets. Things can go wrong very quickly. So you have to have your wits about you, and you have to be prepared to stop things from going. In terms of combat, though, so one of the things which I think helps people like me in my profession is the fact that there is so much going on mentally that you can almost absorb all your effort into just doing your job and not worry about fear. Okay. And actually, if you look back to a lot of interviews from Second World War pilots as well, they'll probably say similar things, where there's so much going on in the air environment, you're trying to keep a mental picture of what's going on at any one time, potentially control your formation, try to put yourself in the best attack or targeting solution, but you don't have time to be afraid.
Wow.
Now, the counter to that, though, is that as you get more experience and as you get better at your profession, and your capacity and your mental ability expands and allows you to think about things, you do begin to, these thoughts can creep in. So some of the worst times in operations was actually waiting to go. I used to get really impatient when we were starting up the airplane and perhaps there was a snag or a problem, and you had to wait to an engineer would come out, have a look at it, and you just want to go. You just want to get going and go, so you can just focus on the job and forget about everything else. And that was quite frustrating, because I think you could let your mind dwell on what could happen potentially. And there were some pretty dangerous situations that I've been in as well in operations. So I think it's two things really, to answer your question succinctly. One is your own kind of sense of mortality, and I think age and family experience has a part to play in that. And then the second part is just how absorbing the job can be. Can definitely play into that as well.
Okay. You mentioned earlier about how around 18, 19, you have some 18 or 19-year-olds could be given responsibilities, and have people in the squads that have been in the military for 20 years plus and deal with the imposter syndrome. Did that sort of peter out over time for you, like imposter syndrome?
It's a great question. I don't know if it ever does fully, to be honest with you. It's funny, and where I sometimes it would come to the fore, or you'd be reminded of it, is when. So it's funny when you're doing any job, and even the job like the ones I've done, after a while it just feels like a normal job. You get up in the morning, usually ridiculously early, the alarm goes off, 5:30 in the morning. You roll into work, you work hard all day, and then you go home, and your wife isn't interested in talking to you about work. She's been working all day, so no one's interested in what you're doing, and you just do that day in, day out. Even though you're doing quite extraordinary things, it just feels like a normal job. And like anything else, everyone's got moans and gripes, oh God, the coffee machine's broken, or whatever it is. So it just becomes normal. And then occasionally when you do get imposter syndrome is when you're asked to go and participate in air shows, or you're asked to go and do something public facing, and suddenly you're met with members of the public who perhaps are not used to being around people like you, and they think that you are something special, and here's you there, just feels like your normal average Joe, effectively, with a wife and two kids which are screaming at home, and suddenly you're put on a bit of a pedestal. And I always did feel a bit troubled by that, where I'm not naturally a very gregarious, extroverted individual. I'm really not. And so to be put in situations where you're almost expected to perform and be something you're not, I did not enjoy that. So I don't mind doing it if I have to do it, but it's not something I would choose to do willingly. Some people are very good at that, and it can be the life and soul of a party. I'm really not that kind of individual, to be honest with you. So I did feel a little bit like imposter syndrome doing that. But in terms of day in, day out on the squadron, I was utterly confident in my own ability and what I was delivering and what value I was adding. So I had no question at all from a professional perspective. It was just in these kind of public-facing roles. It was a little bit awkward.
We have to talk about F-35As. We just have to, because I spent time yesterday and I'm like, oh my goodness, what sort of engineer is this? For the sake of to our listeners who might not be familiar with like aircrafts, and could you please explain a bit about why the F-35Bs are really special and really rare? I think last I checked, there were about 34, 35 active ones in the UK. So what makes the F-35Bs like the real main deal?
It's a phenomenal aircraft. So I'll talk about the B first of all, and then I'll talk about the F-35 as much as I can do, because it's still quite a sensitive aircraft. So there's three models of the F-35, the A, B and C, and the B model is by far the most impressively from an engineering perspective. And the party trick the F-35B can do is it can hover. So you can effectively slow the aircraft down to, in fact, you can even go backwards as well, which is a bit funny. First time you do that, you can actually go backwards at a steady pace as well.
Like reversing.
Yeah, so it's a bit like as you go back. But yes, it can slow and it can hover, and you can land it vertically as well. So, and that's very useful for our particular way we use it, because we fly from the Queen Elizabeth class aircraft carriers, and that's the only way in which we can land currently on the aircraft carrier. But the other thing the aircraft can do, which is really impressive, is anywhere between going from what I call normal sort of conventional flight, where you've got air going over the wings and that's generating lift, to thrust-borne flight. Thrust-borne flight is when you're using a proportion of the engine to provide lift as well by vectoring the engine outlets, if you like. You can, everything from stopping and hovering to that sort of full airborne flight, you've got various grades in between. So you can do various types of slow landing. You can do slow takeoffs as well, so you can take off in a very short strip. We can do various types of landing such that you can do something called an RVL, a rolling vertical landing, which is where you can bring the aircraft, you can very accurately put the aircraft down on a particular point on, let's just say, a motorway or a small road, and you can bring it to a halt very quickly within a few hundred feet. So it's really quite versatile. And the aircraft we had, which was very similar to that up until about 2010, was a Harrier, which was the first sort of very successful British aircraft which could do that as well. But the difference between the F-35 and the Harrier is that the Harrier required a lot of manual flying to work the hovering and so on. The F-35, a lot of it was automated.
Right.
So it was still, I mean, it would still bite you. Still, if you didn't look after yourself very carefully, it could still damage you. But the computers and the flight control system did a lot of the hard work for you.
Right.
So it was actually a relatively stable and straightforward aircraft to fly.
And as we start to wrap up this episode now, this has been really amazing. Thank you so much, Dave. You've had an amazing career in the Air Force. Yeah, 22 years. Spent 22 years. You've grown through the ranks. Became a wing commander. You led the 617 Squadron Dambusters. What would you say have been some of your core tip or your key career lessons from that growth? Lessons or tips that have helped you grow through the ranks over the years.
Yeah, it's a phenomenal question, and I think if I was to sum it up in one particular item, it would be people, and it would be appreciating people around you. So I think that whatever organisation you're in, people make things happen. People provide the energy, the passion, and the delivery of anything.
Yeah.
So therefore, what I have learned is that one, if you have well-led, motivated people who genuinely feel as if they are looked after and that you have their best interests at heart, even when everything else is falling around, then they will do anything for you.
Wow.
And people have never, ever failed to surprise me, where you take someone and you give them an opportunity and you give them the necessary support. It's very rare that I've been let down.
Wow.
And people will always amaze you at what we're capable of doing, even if they don't believe it themselves.
Right.
So I think it's an ability to recognise that everyone has something to contribute, to give them the opportunity. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you give everyone the same opportunity.
Yeah.
You've got to look at people as individuals, and irrespective of their cultural background or what they're competent at or what their skill set is like, you can, if you're intelligent enough and you care enough, you can tailor a path for any individual to achieve as much as they possibly can. And I think that is one of the biggest lessons I've learned from my experience, and certainly what I try to apply in JP Morgan as well, coming in. And it's nice when I'm having conversations with people or I'm mentoring people as well, and they talk to me about my approach to individuals, my approach to educating, training, motivating as well. And that's all from the experience I've built over the past 25, 30 years.
Gotcha. And how are you finding the transition to JP Morgan, or if I use the phrase civilian life? Because you've spent a huge chunk of your life sort of in the military, in the Royal Air Force, and now you're almost like suddenly in a completely different sector, right? How are you finding the transition, actually?
It's a great question, and it's an obvious one to ask. So I'm really enjoying it, first of all.
Okay.
I am, because I think, and there's a number of reasons why. I think one of the bigger reasons is because, and one of the reasons why I left the military is it was really for family stability, to be honest with you, where I was at a point in the military where my career was taking me down a certain path, which I wasn't convinced I really wanted to do. And I was very nomadic in terms of I was moving a lot, and my family was very upset by that. And I thought to myself one day, if I'm not careful, I'm going to wake up at being 60 years old one day, looking to retire, and I haven't really lived with my family, or my family have been to, my eldest daughter had been to 5 different schools. And could I live with the fact that things could have been different and we could have had stability? So that played a big part in leaving the military. And then the other thing was the point about economics earlier on. So my parents, I said we were teachers, but I didn't say what we taught. So they were both business education teachers. We taught finance and accounting and economics and management studies. And I really enjoyed that school. And when it came to university, and I chose aeronautical engineering as my path, but economics was a very close second. I've always had an interest in economics, the markets, and how economies drive things as well. So I've always had a sort of a very gifted amateur kind of thought about that. So when it came to leaving, I thought to myself, do you know what? I have this hunger and itch to do something in finance, and I always have had. And technology, I have been around technology for the best part of 20 years, and my final job in the Air Force was working on the Future Combat Air System, our future fighter program. I was one of the senior requirements managers in that program and one of the strategists. So I was wrestling with problems about artificial intelligence and machine learning in 2040 plus, and how we use that on a system like we're trying to design. So a lot of the discussions we're having in JP Morgan in technology are quite similar. Architecture, open system architecture, CI/CD. So it all felt very familiar, and to me it felt, this is perfect. We made the decision to go back home to Glasgow. We're both from the city. Our families are still here. They're getting on a bit now, but they're still here. We can give our daughter stability. I can scratch that finance itch I've had for many years, and I can be around technologists who I really enjoy being around. Yeah. So for me, it was perfect. And coming into the firm, I have really enjoyed the culture. I've enjoyed meeting people like you in the firm. Everyone's been very welcoming. I really like working with bright people who are very driven, very passionate about what we do. And the transferable skills I've learned in the military have been absolutely applicable here too. So I enjoy being able to make a difference as well. On the counter side, though, on the flip side, there has been lots of challenges too. So technology, as in this type of technology, is new to me. So I'm not a developer by any stretch of imagination. So just the language, and even though I'm familiar with financial services language and terminology, until you're actually in the bank, in the firm, and you get the full raft of things coming towards you, it's a new language as well. So you've got the kind of double whammy of, I've got to learn finance, brokerage, and I've got to learn technology as well. And then you have the really annoying thing where military abbreviations are the same as the firm abbreviations, but they're different. But for me, the pleasing thing about that, though, is that every day is different, because it's a challenge every day. Because, hey, I don't understand that. I need to learn a little bit more about that. So I am having a ball. I really am. I'm enjoying the culture. I'm enjoying making a difference. I'm enjoying learning and understanding about our world we're in. And I'm glad that when people do come up to me and say, hey, that was great, Dave, or that's a really interesting perspective. Yeah. And I can say, actually, I got that from 15 years ago doing this. I can relate it back entirely. Right. So there's so much that's transferable, and actually give a lot of strength to veterans or people thinking of leaving the military and looking at careers, and that they have so much to offer, and they won't realise it probably until they're actually out doing a job, and then they can look in retrospect and say, oh yes, I can absolutely see now what Dave is saying.
Yeah. Did you have almost like an identity crisis, in the sense of, for 20 plus years you've been known so solely in the Air Force, and you'd rose in ranks, but here it's very different, isn't it? Did you have that at all? I just keen to know, and if so, how did you deal with it?
Do you know what? That's another fantastic question, and not as much as I did. I think I surprised myself, not as much as I thought I would.
Oh, that's good.
So I think you're right. I think a lot of people said to me that obviously I had a fantastic career in the Air Force, and I was on a particular path in the Air Force, which would have taken me probably higher up in my career. And a lot of people, when I made the decision to leave, a lot of people who knew me and who were in the Air Force said, why are you throwing away this? And that was the common question asked. And I would explain why, in terms of my family situation and the fact that I wasn't particularly happy with where my career was going, potentially. I could see where my path was going to end up. And I thought, and people said to me, well, you're going to basically start at square one again, in essence. And actually, what I have surprised myself about is, and what I think I've done relatively well in the past 8 months or so, is to be humble. So is to recognise that I have got a lot of experience, and I do not need to shout about that experience. It will just come to the fore as I'm doing my thing. I've said to you before, I'm not a real extroverted person. I'm one of these people who just likes to be recognised for getting on with something quietly and just doing a good job, and people and just building up a bit of a reputation for delivering and for doing things on a certain path. And I think the acceptance that, hey, do you know what? In terms of my bigger lifestyle choices, I'm in the city. My kids are at the same school and they're not going to move schools again. Wife is very happy. We have a new home and I've got a fantastic job in the city centre of Glasgow, which is not a very far commute in the morning. I'm living pretty much a normal lifestyle. It's normal, certainly compared to what I've done previously. It's a normal lifestyle.
You're not dropping bombs. I'm dropping bombs.
Correct. And I'm happy.
Yeah.
And I'm happy. So despite any ego trips that some people may think I have or any ego depressions, it doesn't matter because I am in a job, doing a job which I enjoy. I am adding value. Yes, I certainly do not have anywhere near as much responsibility as I had previously, but hey, do you know what? I'm quite enjoying that for a change. It's nice to have a little bit less responsibility from time to time and focus on other things. So yes, so I am. I'm very content. I suppose
Amazing.
phrase.
That's amazing. So Dave, that last section is a reflective section. And the first question is a question we ask all our guests on the podcast. And it is, if your life was a book, what would this title be? So if you look at all your experiences, your journeys, your stories.
So I think it would have to be flying related, but have something to do with an inner confidence. So I would go for something like Flying Blind Fast.
Ooh, that's a good book title, actually. That's a good one. Okay, so Flying Blind Fast. Second question is, as you look back on your life's journey and stories, what are you most grateful for?
I think I'm quite proud of the decision I made to leave the military, because I think it would have been very easy to stay in and probably to continue to excel in the military and probably rise to a relatively high rank in the military. And actually, the decision I've taken for the benefit of my family, and because I looked ahead and I said, and I tried to look holistically at my life at that point and said, what do I really want for us? What is good for us? And I'm utterly certain at this stage in my life, with another 15 to 20 years of working life remaining, to give my family stability so I can be with them, to give them what they need. I think I'm quite proud of that decision.
It's amazing.
It's a tough decision.
And yeah, I think we need to have an episode at some point in the future about like family life balance and work-life balance. But the last question is two-pronged. And it's if you could talk to 18-year-old Dave. So if imagine just 18-year-old Dave right now, you could tell him many things, get advice. It could be a tip, it could be anything. What would it be?
I think probably to lighten up a bit. Yeah, I think so. I think one of the things with my experience and my kind of life journey is that it's been so focused. It's been so much like hard work. It has been. There is a lot of work that's gone into that, and I think sometimes that's been at the expense of perhaps denying myself certain things I could have done. I mean, very much the mentality in the Air Force, particularly when I was on a squadron flying, it was work hard, play hard. Particularly when you went away in exercise or on deployment. So, but I think, and I suppose the work hard was driven with an ambition to try and be the best that you possibly could be, to prove yourself to the squadron that you were that leader, you were that person you could rely upon, you could deliver. And yes, I think that's always going to be the case with people like me in those types of jobs. But I think there's definitely scope for more fun and to let your hair down a little bit more. So I think I would have said just, work hard, but take it in, enjoy it. It's okay to maybe not do as much tonight and go and have that drink or go and play that game of squash or go out for that run with that friend or whatever else, as opposed to slaving away all the time. So I think it would have been that, just lighten up a bit. And particularly when my family came along and my kids when they were younger, enjoy the time with them.
Wow.
Because I don't think I did afford enough time with them on occasion. Because of work and because of the demands of work. So yes, enjoy the time with the people that you have and just enjoy the moment a bit more.
Enjoy the moment. And to flip that question, if imagine it was 80-year-old Dave in the future listening to this conversation, what's something you'd like to tell him from you right now?
It's going to be okay. I think because I know it's funny, but my wife is still very much in the military, fantastic career. She's doing phenomenally well. And she's, I think, naturally, because I have left and she's seeing what's the journey and path I've been on, she's thinking about when that may be for her and what she would do as well. And I think that's one of the things which troubles people leaving the armed services is, what do I do next? I've been in this bubble for so long, so it's quite a challenging thing. So, and she's very similar age to me, so she's the same kind of big questions in life about, hey, I want to still be there for my kids and I want to enjoy them in their final years at school, going to university, that type of thing. So I think I think probably just look back, say it's going to be okay. Both of you will be fine. Just, you've done well up until now. Nothing to say that's going to change. Trust your gut. Enjoy the family. Make the most of the time you have. And life decisions will work themselves out. They always seem to.
It's going to be okay. Yeah. Honestly, Dave, thank you so much for your time. It's been a privilege, honestly, just listening to your stories, and I'm grateful that we had this conversation. And thank you very much for your service as well. I think I was telling you this when we met at the lunch table a couple of weeks ago, that on behalf of myself and everybody else, listeners of the podcast, thanks to you, to your wife. Sorry, what's your wife's name?
Kelly.
Kelly, thanks very much for your service, and to all people who are serving in the military, in the Royal Air Force. We truly appreciate your service. Thanks for all your sacrifices. And for folks looking to connect with Dave, we'll plug his LinkedIn in the show notes, so feel free to. I'm sure he'd love to hear about your reviews of this and comments that you have. But honestly, once again, thank you very much, everyone, for listening. It's been such a pleasure conversing with you, Dave. I really appreciate this conversation. Until next time, have a wonderful one. And thank you very much. Bye.